I don't think I've ever talked at an art museum before, or to primarily perhaps an audience of art aficionados. So it's a real pleasure to be here. But it's not that surprising that I'm here, given that the exhibit is about migration, and given how I feel about migration. Migratory birds and the behavior of migration, I think, is perhaps one of the most spectacular behaviors that we see in all of nature, no matter where you are. Migration has a simple definition. It's the repeated annual movement of organisms from a breeding area to a non-breeding area and back again to a breeding area. There are more complex definitions, but I prefer the simple definition. It's seen in a variety of animal taxa. We see migration in everything from butterflies, the monarch butterflies that go down to Michoacan, Mexico every year and through multiple generations and then back again. We see it in a variety of moth species. We see it in dragonflies. We see it in amphibians that go to their vernal pools every spring to reproduce and then go back to foraging areas for the majority of the annual cycle to feed and survive. We see it in a lot of reptiles, snakes that go back and forth from their winter hibernacula out to other areas out in the forest, to sea turtles that return to their beaches to breed and to lay eggs every year and then go back out to sea. Where they go, we don't know. We see it in fish, salmon, a wonderful example of migratory organism, these amazing fish that come up to these streams where they were supposedly born, and they lay their eggs, and in many cases die, unless you're a steelhead, in which case you can go back out to sea again. These small eggs develop into fish, the smaller fish, these smolt, and they go back out to sea. This black box we don't know anything about once they leave the streams. We don't know where they go, we don't know how they survive, we don't know why they die. It's this amazing mystery. We see it in a variety of mammals. We see it in whales. Whales migrate. Great blue whales, the largest creature that's ever lived on this earth, bigger than any dinosaur, migrates. It's a migratory animal. Many whales are migratory. Orcas are migratory. Dolphins are migratory. Wildebeest are migratory. But, all that said, when you think of migration, of course I'm biased, but I think of birds. I think of birds when I think of migration. And this idea of migration, I think, it's been around for a long, long time in the birds themselves, but it stirred people's emotions for a long, long time. And you can actually see it in the writings of Aristotle. He was born in around 380 or so BC. He was one of the first people to think about migratory birds. And this idea sort of baffled him. Where are these birds going? And he came up with several theories that lasted for hundreds of years, in part because of this man, Aristotle, came up with this theory. No one was going to question it. But he talked about these birds, these robins, the European robin, disappearing. And what he said was they didn't actually disappear. They transmutated into this other species called a blackcap, which obviously is total ridiculous nonsense. Sorry, Aristotle. But it's true. It's what he came up with. He also hypothesized that terns and swallows, when they disappeared, he didn't really get the whole notion of migration. He said that they actually went into holes in the mud in the marshes, terns and swallows. And actually, Linnaeus, fairly famous biologist, drew a few pictures. I don't know if he drew the pictures, but there's pictures credited to him where he's showing people actually with nets, seine nets, coming out of the marsh, actually netting swallows. And so this brings up a lot of credibility issues with Linnaeus, but we don't need to go there. So, but the problem is, and the point here is that this migratory movement has baffled us for years, and our inability to track these animals has also baffled us. And I would argue that we're not that much further along than when Aristotle first started thinking about this. And that's what I'll be talking about today, this notion of where do these birds go? So now we know that a lot of these birds, and I'll focus mainly on birds today, we know their overall ranges. We know, we see a bird that might be breeding in North America. We know its range, it's the species range in North America. We know its winter range. But what we don't know is where these particular populations are. We don't know, for the most part, where the birds that are breeding in Rhode Island, where they spend their winters, where they migrate through, their migratory paths. We don't know that. We don't know exactly where they go to spend the majority of the annual cycle on their wintering grounds. So this mysterious thing is actually quite important for understanding various facets of the biology of migratory animals in general, whether you're a butterfly, an amphibian, a snake, a wildebeest, or a bird. Understanding this phenomenon of migratory connectivity is essential for so many reasons, and that's what I'm going to talk about this evening. This idea of migratory connectivity, just to go over it briefly again. And let me say, I'm going to be talking about biology this evening, and I'm going to try to talk about it in a way that it's accessible. But if you have a question, please, I don't mind at all if you raise your hand and let's just get clarity on a particular issue. Totally fine with that. So migratory connectivity is simply the geographic linking of individuals or populations between different stages of the annual cycle, between this breeding stage, the migratory pathway these animals take, and their winter stages. This is a hypothetical species made up of sort of several populations on the breeding area and several populations during the winter. And what we don't know is how they're connected. This is just, again, a hypothetical situation. Birds from one breeding area could disperse out throughout their entire winter range, and this would be fairly weak connectivity, right? We don't know where they're going. Are all of these just dispersing all over the place? Alternatively, birds could be showing strong connectivity, such that individual populations here, say in the Northeast, are all going down to a particular area down, say, in the Dominican Republic, down here in the Caribbean. And likewise, areas in the western parts of the population could be going over here into parts of Mexico. So this would be an example of tight connectivity. Now this, again, and I'll say this over and over again tonight, has very important implications for how we understand their biology, how these animals might be moving pathogens, diseases, and a variety of things. If these birds, and the point is that for most species, we don't know the strengths of migratory connectivity. But if you're a bird that's going from here, say in your backyard in Rhode Island, and you're spending the winter, say, in the eastern portions of the Dominican Republic, of Haiti, even before the hurricane, or before the earthquake, Haiti was it's almost deforested. The birds that go there for the winter just have horrible success over that period of time. So if there's strong connectivity there, all these birds, say in Rhode Island, are going down to Haiti, it's likely that there's winter events there are going to have disastrous impacts on what happens to those birds, both during migration and when they get back up to their breeding grounds. So understanding those things, we can manage animals as much as we want to blue in the face on breeding areas for that short 3-month period of the time. But unless we consider things throughout the entire annual cycle, we're wasting our time. And folks, that's what we're doing, just to let you know. So, just to explain a little bit more about the total annual cycle for a migratory bird, it's made up of basically 4 main periods. The breeding period, which is in red down here at the bottom, goes from about May. If a bird arrives back up into the Northeast in about May, males and females will come together, they'll build a nest, they'll breed, raise young. And in some cases they'll do that twice. They'll raise 2 broods of young. At the end of the breeding cycle, the males and females split. It's sayonara, baby. They'll molt. They change all their feathers at that point. They lose their feathers, they grow new feathers. It's an amazing physiological process. They're not with their fledglings anymore for the most part. Now this varies. If you're an osprey or if you're a larger bird, the period of parental care will continue to some degree. But a lot of the birds I'll be talking about today are songbirds, and there are always some variants out there. But they'll molt in this period of August. This is a period of time we know almost nothing about as well, because we can't track the birds. Again, it's that movement, it's that disappearance. We don't know where they're going. We just don't know how to track them. At that point, they go on this pretty amazing migration, this fall migration. It could vary anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 weeks to 2 months. We don't know. And they get down to the wintering grounds, which, again, could be all over the place, and it's there where they spend the majority of the annual cycle. They're on these wintering areas in the tropics for most of the year, anywhere from September and October all the way to April and May. It's in the tropics. And what I'll be talking about today, one of the things I'll be talking about is, again, the importance of understanding this migratory connectivity, but I'll be doing that through examples. And the examples are that these periods, and what I'm going to be emphasizing is that these periods of the annual cycle interact. So what happens in the winter period influences what happens here on the breeding grounds. So you can't study a bird back on Rhode Island without thinking about what that bird experienced prior to getting there. We are who we are today because of the paths that we've taken to get here. The same is true for any organism. So we have to study animals in the context of the annual cycle. And because we haven't been able to track these animals, because we don't understand their migratory connectivity, this has been a big problem. And you'll see we've made some inroads here, but we've got a long way to go. So why study migratory connectivity? Well, here, I'll give you some more examples. for basic conservation purposes, population vulnerability. So the monarch butterflies, 4 years ago, there was a really strong cold snap that hit in the mountains of Michoacan, Mexico. And I think there are estimates like 3 billion, 4 billion monarch butterflies died. There was actually snow on these hilltops in Michoacan. And these areas were just discovered, I think, in the late 1960s, 1970s, this wintering area for monarch butterflies. And for several years after that, and still today, the numbers of monarch butterflies are really low. And we wouldn't have known what's happened had we not actually found the wintering area of these animals, of these monarch butterflies. But more importantly, since we know the population connection of these monarchs, we can actually help the Mexican government to put these areas aside and protect these important sanctuaries for monarch butterflies. And that's going fairly well, but not all that well. There are other populations of monarchs, by the way, that actually spend the winter on the Florida Keys. There's another population in the western U.S., in Southern California, and down in the Baja. But this is the largest monarch butterfly population down in Michoacan, Mexico. But again, it helps us sort of direct and prioritize conservation efforts in terms of land protection. Anyone know what this is? Kirtland's warbler. This is North America's most endangered songbird. Kirtland's warbler breeds in a very small area in the jack pine forests of Michigan. And their numbers were down to about 200 individuals in the 1970s and early 1980s. People started studying them and they started realizing, at that time, nobody knew where they spent the winters. Nobody knew where they migrated. We had no idea where they were going. But we knew that there were about 200 individuals left. We started to study them, not me, the royal we. They started to realize that cowbirds were parasitizing their nests. So these Kirtland's warblers were actually becoming cowbird factories, producing lots of young cowbirds. And the areas were just being demolished through habitat destruction. And because they're so specialized on the specific jack pine forest and habitat type, they had to just try to study that and really figure out which successional stage of jack pine was important to them. So now they've been doing that, and now we're back up to about 1,500 individuals. But just about 10 years ago, we started to actually, as these numbers started to go up, they started to find these birds in the Bahamas. And then just about 5 years ago, and there were some records, but never any solid records. About 5 or 6 years ago, a friend of mine found actually a sizable population of Kirtland's warblers on the island of Eleuthera in the Bahamas, and we've been able to actually start studying their wintering biology and banding them in the winter. And because their numbers are so small, we actually refined, I study the species in fact, we actually find birds that my colleague Joe Wonderly has banded, color banded, on the island of Eleuthera, back up in Michigan. And we actually find them about 7 days later after they've been seen in the island of Eleuthera. So they make it from the Bahamas up to the jack pine forest of Michigan in about 7 days. But the point here is that just for population vulnerability, if you want to protect these species, you need to protect their ranges year-round. So you need to know where they're going. And this could be for specific populations. But there's lots of other reasons. Just for understanding population abundance, we don't really understand what causes species to decline, what causes species to remain stable, what causes species to increase. These dynamics of these numbers, it sounds complicated, but it's really quite simple. This is what conservation is all about. It's really about protecting these numbers, making sure animals are common when they're common. If we don't understand why their numbers are declining, how can we really save them? If we don't understand why they're increasing, we don't understand anything about their dynamics. And in order to understand the dynamics, and I'll talk about a specific example of this in just a few minutes, you need to understand how different factors influence the condition of individual birds throughout the year. You need to understand how these factors influence the populations throughout the year. And I'll talk about the specific biology of this. I'll show you a model, a statistical model that demonstrates this. But we're not even close to that yet. Impacts of climate change. People are throwing around numbers such as, we're going to lose 20% of our species in 50 years. I'm a firm believer in climate change, but I'm not a firm believer in those sorts of numbers, primarily because we know so little about how birds migrate, where different populations are moving, and how climate's about to impact these different things. We just don't know. We don't know how climate change is going to impact many of these organisms because we don't know something as fundamental as migratory connectivity. And then there's all sorts of other reasons to understand migratory connectivity, just for the basic ecology, the behavior, the evolution, everything about their reproductive biology, their mating systems, everything about their life history strategies, their evolution. All these things need to be studied in the context of the annual cycle. Natural selection acts on these animals throughout the year, when they're in Jamaica, when they're in Peru, no matter where they are. Back in Rhode Island, we need to understand them in this context, and we need to understand the same individuals. We can't follow them. They're too small, and the areas they travel are just too vast. And then recently, and this was sort of a little bit of a boondoggle for me, was people started to see that bird migration can also be a way that pathogens are spread. West Nile virus, avian influenza. Now, we can argue as to whether or not birds are actually doing it, because we really don't know if they're doing it. It's quite complex. But they're probably playing some sort of a role in the spread of pathogens. Now, just to put this in a different sort of a light, the reason they're playing this role is because of our global trade and because of our economies. That's why this is happening. It's not because of the natural migrations of birds. It's because of how we're moving pathogens around the world through our trade and various things. We can talk about that later, but it makes it very hard to, make predictions about where an emerging infectious disease will show up next if we don't know where the birds are themselves going to show up next, right? Does that make sense? Is everyone on the same page? So let's look at a couple of these examples in a little bit more depth. Let's look at population abundance and how it's essential that we study these birds throughout their annual cycle, where they're migrating and where they're going back to every year in order to understand these birds, their numbers and their ecology. And what I'll be talking about is this concept of seasonal interaction, this idea that events in one period of the annual cycle influence events in subsequent periods. And one of the things I'll be talking about a little bit later is that almost all the research that takes place, 95% of the research that takes place in ecology, is focused on one period of the annual cycle. It doesn't really incorporate these previous experiences that animals are exposed to, but it has to. And the way I think about these things is I think about them occurring at two different levels. They occur sort of at the population level, where they influence an entire regional sort of a thing, or group of animals within a species. And we think of these as density-dependent effects. So you can have really high reproduction in one year, and there's a lot of young that are produced. It's a good year for birds. The number of animals that are produced will then go down to the wintering areas, and there's a lot more animals fighting for really reduced numbers of resources. This causes mortality. This has all sorts of impacts. These are what are known as density-dependent effects, and I'll explain this in just a minute. Or you can think about them as individual level effects. That is, an individual animal is exposed to, say, conditions in Haiti, where it's not living in forests, it's forced to live in a bauxite mine, or in Jamaica, it's forced to live in a bauxite mining area because 90% of Jamaica is deforested now. So it's living in this bauxite mining area. It loses condition over the winter period. It's in really bad condition, but it migrates back. It's taking that condition with it. It's called a carryover effect. So that individual, even though it's going to migrate back and get back to a breeding area, it may not be in the best condition for raising young. Its survival may actually be compromised because of the conditions it was actually exposed to. So these are called carryover effects, individual level carryover effects. But both of these things are, in seasonal interactions more generally, are sort of one of the big reasons for understanding migratory connectivity. So let's talk about population size specifically. On the x-axis, you've got total population size. And remember, I am a biologist, okay, so I've got to show you some graphs. On the y-axis, this is sort of a density. So as you go up, you have more and more, higher and higher density. E is the total population size. So this graph refers to the winter mortality, the number of animals that die during the non-breeding season. This line refers to the net breeding output, so the number of young that are produced. Now, when you look at both of these together, this is what you get. You consider how many animals die, how many young are produced. At the end, it equals the total population size. Well, you can manipulate this a little bit to see how events during the annual cycle influence E, or the total number of young produced. And believe it or not, most people haven't done this. When they look at population size, the only thing they consider is total breeding output. They don't think about that. So this guy Sutherland, a Brit, did this. He changed winter mortality. He increased winter mortality to here, and he changed and kept the total number of young produced constant, and he changed population size here. It declined to E1. Well, you can do the exact opposite as well. You can change your total breeding output, reduce it to here, and keep winter mortality constant. And what you do is you change your population size to E2. Now, this is a really important point. Winter events drive population size even lower than breeding season events. It might seem a little detailed, but it's actually a totally non-trivial result. The population change here, it depends on the relative strengths of density-dependent mortality during winter versus total reproductive success. So what this says is we need to put our conservation efforts into wintering grounds, not into breeding grounds. So in this case, the consequences of, say, habitat loss for the season in which there's the strongest density dependence, or you have the highest mortality, is the period that's most limiting. And for the oyster catchers, it's winter. It's not breeding. So, unfortunately, there are almost no examples. That's just a model that's based on some really, really weak data for oyster catchers. We don't have that for most species. That's what we need. That's what we're working towards, but we're not really that close at all. We have a weak understanding of migratory connectivity. I'm going to drive this into your guys' heads by the end of the evening, and there'll be a test, and there'll be one question, what's migratory, what's important? Is it migratory connectivity? Is it the Super Bowl, or is it, it'll be migratory connectivity. And there are very few estimates of this density dependence concept. It's a very important concept, but there's very little research on it. And, as I'll mention again, most of the research, 90% of the research, or 75% of all the research that happens, is focused on breeding season areas, breeding season events. What happens during this 3-month period of the annual cycle in North America, not just in North America, actually it's also biased in Europe. Most of the European literature is biased towards breeding season biology. We know very little about what happens during this very important non-breeding stage. As I mentioned, I did a literature search on this. 75% of all the literature is focused on breeding season, only about 12% on migration, and 10% during winter. There's another 3% that looks at the interactions of the annual cycle, and most of that's mine. There's very little work on this. So now we talked about the population level effects. Let's look at these individual level effects. Most of the work that I do, or most of the work I used to do, now my students and postdocs do it, takes place in Jamaica, small little island here just south of Cuba. We work in the southwestern portion of Jamaica, and a lot of the work that I do is on a species known as the American redstart. It's a long-distance migratory bird. It's a very common breeder here in Rhode Island. It's got a fairly wide distribution. You can see up here all the way from actually Louisiana up into Newfoundland, almost into Alaska. And their winter range is on throughout Central America, Mexico, North and South America, and throughout the greater Antilles. I've got about 20 people down there right now in Jamaica just studying the American redstart. But here I am talking to you all. The interesting thing is that for most of these species, after their pair bond breaks at the end of the breeding season, the males and females don't interact anymore. In fact, because we don't understand migratory connectivity, we don't really know where those individuals go. But we know on the wintering areas, males and females defend individual and exclusive territories aggressively. And the way we catch them is we actually put up a mist net, and we have a decoy of a stuffed bird that I've made. We put it at the base of the net, and we broadcast chips and their songs. And because these birds are territorial, they're very aggressive, and they fly around the net and then dive into the net. And then we do various things to them. We pull their blood to look at genetics, to look at a variety of chemical markers that I'll talk a little bit about. We put bands on their legs, aluminum bands, color bands, unique combination of color bands. So then, after we release them, we can then watch them. And we spend hours and hours and hours watching these birds, learning about their little soap operas, because they have all these soap operas. By the end of our winter period, we'll get down there in January and we'll catch a bunch of birds, and we'll be there until the mid-May when the birds start to leave, or they've all left by then. But we'll have hundreds of these territories mapped out, because we'll watch green over blue aluminum for hundreds of hours. We'll know exactly where it goes. We'll know who its neighbors are. We'll know when it tries to sneak off and interact and get food in a different sort of a habitat. So we learn a lot about the natural history and the biology of these animals through capturing them and through the behavioral observations that we actually take on them. The neat thing is after they leave in mid-May, not only are they showing really high site attachment to these territories over the winter period, because they get there in September, October, and they're there until mid-May again. But once they go back up to their breeding areas, they come right back, and they go right back to that small little territory. So in this room, this stage could be the territory of a bird. And that bird comes down. We think our birds in Jamaica are originating the U.S.-Canada border. That bird will come back and go right back to that territory. We've had several birds come back 12 years in a row. 3 birds have made that long-distance migration 24 times. And a redstart weighs about 6 or 7 grams. That's how much a quarter weighs. It's a very light bird, but it's a mean machine. We study them in a couple different habitats, but the habitats I'll be talking about primarily is this really wet, lush black mangrove habitat and this really dry scrub habitat. And they occupy both of these habitats. And what we found over the years is that their performance over the winter is driven by the habitat that they occupy. So again, we catch the birds in the January when we get down there, and then we catch them 3 months later. The same individual birds, we recapture them. And we basically do physicals on them each time we look at them. So we can actually see how their condition has declined in certain habitats relative to other habitats. And what we find is that if you're in black mangrove habitat, which stays wet for most of that winter period, you maintain your condition. You maintain your body condition. You're as heavy as you were when we first caught you. You leave earlier in spring to get back up to breeding areas, and your annual survival is high. They have very high survival. Contrast this to the scrub habitat, which over the winter period loses its leaves, gets very, very dry. It's a very, very harsh environment. These animals in this habitat, which I might add are mainly females, decline in their condition. They are not dying as much, but their condition declines. They're losing weight. Their stress hormones go up. They're just not in the best of shape. They leave significantly later than birds in the mangrove, and they have low survival. More of those birds are dying. Now, why is this important? Well, because I think, and I thought back then, this is about 15 years ago that I did this initial work, that these conditions during winter, these habitats on the wintering grounds, can be really important because they can drive things that happen back on breeding areas. They can influence the reproductive success of birds back on these breeding areas all the way up in North America. And as I've said, it can really make a big difference if you're originating in a place like Belize, which is mainly forested, or if you're in a place like Jamaica or Haiti, which is mainly deforested. Yes, please.
Is there any reason why females tend to be in the scrub?
Because the males kick them into there. The males are behaviorally dominant over the females, and they push them out into the scrub.
Out of the mangrove?
Out of the mangrove. So we can pull a bird out of the mangrove habitat, do a removal experiment, and a female will move back into that area. If we pull a bird out of the scrub habitat, nobody will move into that habitat. I've done a lot of that. We can talk about it's a phenomenon called sexual habitat segregation. And it's actually really an interesting phenomenon. We can talk about that a little bit later.
Is it consistent? I mean, maybe you don't know that, but if a female survives being in the scrub and goes back to breed, you tag them enough to know that they go back to the scrub because you say they tend to go back to that same.
They do go back to the scrub.
Do they ever try to go back to the
They try to go back to the mangrove, and most of them don't make it unless they're bigger birds. Some females that are a little bit bigger make it. But what we can do, and we've actually upgraded birds from the scrub habitat. We've removed birds from the mangrove habitat. We've upgraded birds, put them into the mangrove habitat from scrub, and we can increase their condition, increase their departure time, they leave early, and increase their survivorship. So it's a pure habitat effect, and we can actually manipulate their survivorship. Yeah?
Have you been able to follow this through to study banded birds and how many eggs they produce?
Hang on. So the general idea here is that these events that are happening thousands of kilometers to the south, beyond our geopolitical borders that we have no control over, influence this wet-dry habitat gradient, or it could be country of origin, influences the arrival dynamics back on breeding areas, and this can influence the territory quality that these birds acquire, or it can influence their fecundity, which is basically the number of young these animals produce. That's the general idea. And the answer is yes. And I'll tell you what the other answer is that what I've shown, and what I'll show you in just a minute, is that this winter habitat explains most of the variation in reproductive success that we see on breeding areas. More than anything that we have here, whether it's predation, edge effects, habitat quality. It's things that are happening in the tropics that are driving most of the variation in reproductive success. And how did I do this? Because I've just gone and told you that we can't track individuals. We can't, banding, as you'll see, I'll talk about in a little bit, we can band as many birds as, I've banded thousands and thousands and thousands of redstarts in Jamaica. I've never had one returned anywhere, except for back in Jamaica. But no one has ever found one of my redstarts outside of Jamaica, ever. I've banded thousands and thousands of birds back up in the White Mountains in New Hampshire. I've never had anyone return one of my redstarts from any of my breeding areas. I've had a few other birds return, but never my redstarts. They're so small. If a bird with a band dies, and there's so few people looking for them, when one of these birds dies, it's gone in a matter of hours. It's just consumed by ants, it's carried away by a cat, whatever it is. It's just the chances of that band ever being returned is infinitesimally small. So, but how did I track this? How did I actually look at these events in winter and show that they're influencing things back on breeding areas? Well, enter in something known as an isotope. I just described to you that I've studied these birds across a dry to wet moisture gradient, the dry habitat being the scrub, the wet habitat being the mangrove. Well, what also varies across this habitat gradient is it's two things. The ratio of C3 to C4 plants. This refers to the photosynthetic pathways that plants use to process energy. But what also varies is the water use efficiencies of these plants themselves in these habitats. If you're a plant in a really dry habitat, you're going to keep the pores on your leaf surface closed to retain water. If you're a plant in a wet habitat, you'll keep them open a bit more. Now, why this is important is that it actually, as it turns out, influences the amount and the ratio of these heavy carbon isotopes, C12 to C13, that you retain. An isotope is simply an element that varies slightly in its atomic weight. There's carbon, and many elements have these variants to them that vary a little bit in their isotopic, in their atomic weight. And we can actually see they're stable. These are stable isotopes, and we can actually measure them in nature. We can measure carbon, C12, C13. We can measure nitrogen. We can measure hydrogen. We can measure oxygen. We can measure strontium. We can measure sulfur. And we can use these things to indicate several interesting things about the past histories of animals. And I'll give you several examples. But for this example, I'll talk primarily about carbon. So in this case, in this habitat, these plants and the insects eating these plants and the birds eating these insects, I hypothesized would be enriched or heavy in delta C13, which is that isotope. And the plants and the insects and the birds eating those insects, because redstarts are entirely insectivorous, would become depleted in delta C13. And what's interesting is you can look at different tissues, and these different tissues will have different turnover times of these isotopes. So I can pull blood from a redstart, I can spin the blood down, and when you spin your blood down, you get the plasma and you get the red blood cells. The plasma turns over in about 2 or 3 days. The red blood cells turns over in about 4 to 6 weeks. I can clip a toenail. Toenails are constantly turning over. You know, just look at your own nails, a claw or a toenail. I can clip that toenail, and that could give me a signature up to 6 weeks. I can look at muscle, I can look at bone, and I can look at feathers. Birds molt their feathers in at the end of the breeding period, most of their feathers. After it's molted in, it's inert. It doesn't change. So there's other things that we can do with feathers that I'll talk about just a little bit later. But back to the isotopes, the carbon isotopes. So I sampled birds and I sampled insects, not only in Jamaica, but also in Honduras. And I found that birds in the wet lowland forest, the typical wet forest habitat, tended to be fairly depleted, more negative in delta C13. Birds in the mangrove, and I couldn't find any mangrove in Honduras, unfortunately, it's all shrimp farms, were a little bit more enriched. But birds in the scrub and the drier habitats tended to be even more enriched. And why is this important? Well, as I mentioned, they retain these signatures of carbon in their tissues. So because this was a phenomenon found in redstarts across their entire range, I decided I was going to go to New Hampshire to my breeding site and sample birds on arrival and to see if something in the carbon signatures would tell me something about where they were actually wintering, the habitats they were wintering in, and then see if this could tell me something about the reproductive success of these animals. So I'm not tracking the same individuals, but I'm using isotopes as a signature of prior habitat occupancy. So what I predicted was that American redstarts arriving early on the breeding areas would have lower levels of delta C13 relative to redstarts arriving later, which would have the more enriched signatures similar to birds in the really dry habitat. And I would do this just within males, and I would do it just within females. And I also predicted that birds coming back early would be in better physical condition because they're coming from the better habitat than birds arriving back later. So I sampled birds at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest. This was back in 1997, I think. We've done this since at several different places with several different species, and the same results persist. What we found was that for ASY males, these are the older males after second year, so they're older males, birds coming back early have these signatures that are much more depleted, similar to birds coming back from mangrove habitat. And as the arrival period progresses, you get later and later into May and June, the signature becomes more and more enriched, similar to birds coming back from drier and drier habitats. And the same pattern persisted in 2002, and it's persisted in many years, and in males, in females, and in young birds. So what we then did, and we also found that physical condition, this is arrival date, birds arriving back early, birds arriving back late. This is an index of body condition, but birds coming back early tended to be in better condition than birds arriving back later. So again, suggestive that there's a habitat effect driving something thousands of kilometers to the north back on breeding areas. So then what we did was we actually followed these birds, followed their reproductive success back on breeding areas, given their winter habitat origin. And we also looked at other effects and impacts on their reproductive success. And here we have winter habitat origin based upon our isotope signatures, and this is number of young fledged. And what we're able to show is that birds coming from wet forest produced on average about 5 young per year, whereas if you're coming from dry scrub, you're producing at least 2 fewer young, about 3 young. And if you put this into a larger model, what it explains is what I've described to you already, that most of the variation in reproductive success on breeding areas has very little to do with events on the breeding grounds themselves. Not very little, but has less to do with events on breeding areas, and is explained most by things happening thousands of kilometers to the south. This is really important, folks. This suggests that we can do all we want up here to protect our birds, but if we don't think about these things in an annual cycle context, we don't really try to protect their entire annual cycle biology and figure out where these different populations are going, like the Rhode Island birds or the Connecticut birds or whatever they are, we're wasting our time. So, winter habitat occupancy drives these patterns of reproductive success on the breeding grounds. It's a really clear and important result. And our other work suggests that winter condition really drives actual survivorship, mortality. It's winter that does that, not breeding and not migration. And winter habitat, something else, determines this thing called natal dispersal, how far young actually disperse from their breeding area. This is something else we've shown is something that's driven by winter events, things in the tropics. And I won't go into that one. So, I think I've just tried to argue that things that happen to birds, their biology, is driven by events throughout the annual cycle. And the only way we're really going to understand these things in a rigorous way, in ways that it's going to allow us to protect these things in the long term, is through figuring out their migratory connectivity. So what I thought I would do now is describe basically where we are in tracking these wide-ranging animals, because we're actually making some good progress here, and there's some exciting new advances that is allowing us to truly start to understand the migratory connectivity of several animals. So there are these things we call intrinsic markers. These are things like banding. You actually put bands on their legs and you hope to capture the bird again. There's transmitters. These are radio transmitters, things that you actually can put on the backpack of a bird and track it with a receiver. Or there's satellite transmitters, where you can actually put a backpack on a bird and use a satellite to track it. Now, there are real size limitations here. They have to be quite big, at least 170 grams. Birds like ospreys and eagles can be tracked with satellite transmitters. It's very expensive. And then we can also use things like molecular markers to genetics, because birds vary over a large, they can cover large areas of land. Over time, their genetics can differentiate, and we can actually use these markers, theoretically, to look at their connectivity as well. But this hasn't worked so well. There's things like microbes and parasites that might be really specialized. Areas in the populations of the Northeast might have specific types of microbes or parasites in them, and then we can catch these birds in the wintering grounds and assay for these same microbes and parasites. But again, this has not worked all that well, but this theoretically is another area that could be pursued. And then we can also use things that are extrinsic, that are brought into the bird by their outside environment, such as isotopes. And I've already described to you carbon isotopes. I'll describe to you in just a moment another isotope, hydrogen isotope, that has been used quite successfully for getting at this. And then trace elements. Basically, again, it's an example of something in the outside environment that the animal incorporates into its own tissues in reliable and predictable ways, so then we can sample the birds at different times of the year and say, okay, this bird came from this environment that was dominated by cadmium or nickel or whatever it happens to be. So let's look at some examples. Band recovery. Millions and millions of birds have been banded over the years by the bird banding lab in Patuxent, Maryland, and by their sub-permitted bird banders. This is an example of a purple martin. These are data over 50 years. And we know we can get a lot of information, but maybe one of these lines, we get one bird recovery every 3 or 4 years. It's very difficult to understand what's going on with a population of purple martins from here and where they're going. It's just very scattered. You can't really determine much from these data. It's just not very useful. It's interesting, and the act of banding is a very good educational exercise. There's lots of good reasons to do it, but in terms of looking at migratory connectivity, it has not been very useful. We just have a lot more people banding birds here than are down here to actually recover them, and that's the problem. Once they go down into this big black hole, they disappear. Uh-oh. That refers to me. Is there a battery, is there a plug for this? Better hurry. Satellite transmitters. I mentioned satellite transmitters. This is a peregrine falcon. Here's this is wonderful data from satellite transmitters. Two birds banded on the 14th of October on the southern part of the Chesapeake, and one bird ended up in Cuba. The other one went all the way down to Chile, southern South America. It's fascinating, but in order to understand much about this with satellite transmitters, we have to put hundreds of transmitters on these birds, and we're working towards that now. There's a new technology. It's called an archival data tag, and these are spectacular. An archival data tag is very light, and what it does is it records the amount of daylight throughout the day. So it records sunrise and sunset. And by recording, and it archives that into the backpack. So you've got to actually recapture the animal at the next period of the annual cycle, next time of the annual cycle, to take the data off of the archive. So that's the catch. But the data you get are spectacular, because if you know sunrise and sunset, you can pretty much put yourself anywhere. You can figure out where you actually are anywhere on the planet. Thanks. Plus or minus 200 kilometers. And somebody did this with sooty shearwaters, which is a fairly large bird, and they did this, and they actually show these amazing migrations down here from New Zealand all the way up here to the west coast of the US, up to Alaska, up to Russia, and then back again. Just these amazing, they're called figure-8 migrations on these birds. You can see them here a little bit better. But just amazing data from these archival data tags. I did this with a seaside sparrow. They've actually gotten these down now, so they're about 1 gram. And there's a new group that's actually trying to come up with some that are about 0.65 grams. This is a seaside sparrow in the marshes of Delaware. You can see the stalk here. Here's the sensor that records the light. And the data we got this bird back. We banded it in Milford, Delaware. It left on the 12th of October, migrated down to Jacksonville, Florida on the 31st of October and stayed there till early April and then came back again. The problem is this is such a short migration that the differences in sunrise and sunset were not different enough for us to actually detect the migratory pathways. But this data in itself is unheard of. We've never known where seaside sparrows actually spend the winter. So I've gone out now and I've put hundreds of these out. I've got this, I just can't wait for this next breeding season, because I've got them out in wood thrushes here, wood thrushes here, and wood thrushes here. I've got them on Swainson's thrushes, Bicknell's thrushes. I've got them on catbirds. I've got them on willets. I've got them on bobolinks across their entire range. Bobolinks is a species that goes all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, which is an amazing migration, but we've got them on bobolinks in Vermont, Nebraska, and Oregon to try to understand where these populations go. These data are going to be just spectacular, I hope, but they should. There's a variety of efforts out there. There's another group that I'm working with, actually. It's called ICARUS. It's International Cooperation for Animal Research Using Space. And one of the big challenges with satellite transmitters is the cost. We have to use Argos systems and pay for Argos systems to get the data off of the satellite tags. So what we're trying to do is get, this is primarily driven by a guy by the name of Martin Wilkelski, who's now at Max Planck in Germany, is get a low-flying satellite in space that can give us data much cheaper and can be dedicated towards animal movement, trying to track animal movement, animals that are actually carrying these satellite tags. And the idea is it would just be a sort of a space station that would be flying at a much lower level, and we could actually have birds that have transmitters on their back that are kicking information back up here, and we're getting this data in real time. We can actually track these data in real time if it's going right back up to this satellite and back to us. So it's sort of a birds in space sort of an idea. And then, as I mentioned, isotopes have also helped us in our battle in understanding migratory connectivity. As I mentioned, different tissues have different turnover times. Well, when a bird molts in its tail feathers, or any of its feathers, the isotopes that those birds are exposed to will become inert. They don't change. They'll be incorporated in the feathers, and they don't change. So when the birds molt in those feathers on the breeding site, say here in Rhode Island, and they migrate to the wintering grounds, I, Reed, students, postdocs, go down to the wintering grounds, and they catch birds, pull feathers, and then we can look at where those birds actually molted their feathers in. And this time, we're using hydrogen isotopes. Hydrogen isotopes vary with latitude. So if you're down on the Gulf Coast, you're at about -45. It's a unit called parts per mil, and it gets more and more negative as you go further and further north. The problem is it doesn't vary longitudinally. So all we can tell you is latitude. So feathers sampled in the non-breeding period can reflect where that feather was actually molted in. And we've done this with redstarts. We've sampled them throughout their wintering range, and we're seeing some good levels of connectivity, actually. This is the female redstart, the species I study. Birds sampled here tend to be going up towards the northwest, and so on and so forth. There are these pockets. It's not exactly what I want, but it's getting there. So we still really don't have any clear solution for measuring this migratory connectivity, but we're getting there. We think that the best approach is ultimately going to be to integrate multiple markers and also to push the engineers. Keep pushing the engineers to get these things smaller and smaller. Hopefully I've convinced you that this winter habitat occupancy drives fundamental biological processes. And if you're not studying these animals throughout the annual cycle, you're really missing a large picture of what's going on. And understanding this migratory connectivity is really critical for understanding not only the fundamental biology, but for also understanding their conservation and understanding their human health, or our human health, because of the fact that they can transmit these pathogens. These seasonal interactions and these carryover effects influence various facets of their ecology and also their evolution. And finally, we've just started a large initiative, myself and some of my colleagues at the USGS, something called CLIME. It's called Climate Change and Studying Interseasonal Movements of Birds. And it's basically a very large effort or initiative to get money to put satellite transmitters on as many birds as we can that can take satellite transmitters. To put geolocators on as many birds as we can that can take geolocators. We can go out there and do this for most birds. The problem is that we need to articulate to our politicians that this is an important thing, that we need to get the money for this, and that's what I'm doing now. I spend a lot of my time arguing for doing this sort of a thing. There are about 750 species in North America. We can do that for most of these birds. The idea here is to start this off with birds, but then to move to salmon, to move to insects, to move to mammals, and that this would be a global initiative, actually. But we need to track this. It's important for so many different aspects of the biology that I just told you about, as well as various aspects of the conservation of these spectacular creatures. Be glad to take some questions. Yeah.
Do you have any sense from satellite stuff or radar or anything if water birds or songbirds use major river corridors for migration, like the Connecticut corridor?
There is some evidence for that. It depends on, water birds certainly do, because they're dependent on many bodies of water. Shorebirds, for example, require certain mudflats and various things, and they definitely will use those things. And many larger birds actually, you do use corridors. Hawks, for example, don't use rivers, but they'll use different mountain ranges because the thermals and the various wind currents that they use are critical for them to make their flights. Passerines, it's much less understood because we just can't track them, as I've said. But we think that they move on much broader fronts. They're also more challenging because many of the passerines migrate at night. They're nocturnal migrants. Many of the shorebirds and raptors and things migrate during the day. They don't move at night. So it makes it even more challenging because these birds I've been talking about, didn't mention that, they move at night, so it's hard to see them, except when they're killed by cell phone towers or buildings. Yeah?
What is the gender ratio of the early arriving redstarts? And also, the male behavior in the wintering range seems to be counterproductive to facility, so to speak, of the species almost, by driving the females into the scrub.
Well, these animals are I'll answer your second question first. They're very short-lived. You know, most of them die after their first year. So it's about survival of the fittest. It's about survival of the fittest individual. That's the first thing. So they're not going to lose their own condition for the benefit of another individual. Not only that, that female that they're probably kicking out, or it could be a male, is probably not the same female that it's breeding with. That female could be going back to a very different area. So when they come back year after year, these animals that are short-lived have very low levels of mate fidelity. So, you know, the population is persisting for the most part, but the sex ratio is male biased. Most birds have a male biased sex ratio. And it's probably, I think, it's primarily because of higher female mortality on the wintering grounds. Your first question about this, I think I answered that a little bit too with the sex ratio. It's hard to know what the gender ratio is until all individual animals have settled. And once they've settled, then you can look at this sex ratio, and it's male biased.
Males must have to hang around for a little while before.
They do. They do. They get there first, they defend their territories, and because there's fewer females, that's part of the reason why you get such elaborate plumage, because you have really strong sexual selection for bright plumage and other things. That's what's driving this, is this sex ratio dynamics. One of the things that's driving it. Yeah?
Thinking about the exhibit, what do they know about where the passenger pigeons used to migrate to?
You know, I'm guessing it's like most of the birds of that size, and it was probably the southeastern United States. But Rachel, did you find anything else about that?
That's mostly it.
Yeah.
But did it go up into Michigan?
To breed or
Oh, no.
breeding? Yeah, yeah. But a lot of the any other migratory birds of that size that are granivorous like that, like blackbirds and things, tend to go down to the southeastern U.S. Yeah.
I was just wondering, how do you tell when the sensor is small enough and it won't be really affecting the bird's ecology when it's moving into its migratory paths?
It's a very good question. And the typical ratio is 5%. Typically, the thing has to, the transmitter has to be 5% of the total body weight of the bird. And various people have done experiments to show when it's above 5%, it's somewhat arbitrary, no question, but when it's above 5%, you tend to get declines in mass in captive birds or in birds that are recaptured over a time period. For our birds, we put lots of transmitters on birds. We capture them year after year after year, and they still have the backpack on for radio transmitter work that we've done. So we're pretty confident that 5% is not that big of a deal. Now, different transmitters will have different drag on birds. So certain birds that really have different forms of flight, like something called a Hudsonian godwit, that really, its glide is really important to how it moves. It doesn't flap as much, but it glides. When you put a big hunk of machinery on its back, that creates what's known as drag, and that creates a problem. So what some people have done is they've actually created a transmitter that can be implanted into the bird, so that only a little stalk comes out, and there's no drag that's created, and that's been successful. So there are various ways that we've sort of gotten around these issues, whether it's body size or how it's attached. Shorebird, you actually had to put it on its leg, bird's legs. Yeah?
Two questions. One is, do you have any new data on bird health from wind turbines? And the second is, are you getting a lot of cooperation from your colleagues in other countries where the winter grounds?
I am not doing any wind turbine work, but for the most part, wind turbines are taking out bats more than they're taking out birds here in North America. That's not true in all cases. There are some wind turbines that have been placed in inappropriate places, like on the southern parts of the Great Lakes, that are major migratory pathways for birds. And I think what we're figuring out is that these wind turbines have to be shut down during periods of heavy migration and at other times of the year. But it's really, we're getting to the point where we can now convince industry that the conservation is carrying a little bit more weight these days, and that we can influence industry. So wind turbines, we're getting there. It's better than mountaintop coal mining, no question about it. And if we want to continue to use things, we're going to have to use them that require electricity. So I think we just have to be careful we place them and make sure they're not impacting bat populations. That's been the issue, bat populations. Your second question was?
Cooperation with colleagues in other countries where the winter.
Yeah. The problem there is, the U.S. has not taken the lead on creating treaties of international cooperation that will effectively protect most of these migratory animals. There are a few treaties out there, but they have no teeth whatsoever. In these countries like Jamaica and other places, they're financially and socioeconomically so strapped, there's not much that they can do. They can put aside sanctuaries, they can do things like that, but in the 22 years that I've been working in Jamaica, it's become more and more and more deforested, and it's only going to get worse. For most of you probably don't know this, but the Caribbean in general is predicted to go under a severe drying trend. Its overall precipitation is predicted to decline by 30 to 50% over the next 50 years, which basically means it's going to kick it back to the Pleistocene era, which means we could see dinosaurs again. Not really, but that's pretty much what we're talking about. We're going to change, it's related to temperature changes that are actually going on in the Arctic, but it's changing major precipitation patterns. And the Caribbean, more than anywhere else in the tropics, is going to really, really get hit hard in terms of precipitation. That's one of the things we're studying is what's happening with climate change in the tropics. Most people are focused on the Arctic, but climate change in the tropics in the form of changes in precipitation, not temperature, are having major impacts. So it's hard to go down there and say, folks, what are you doing? In Haiti, for example, you got to do more, you got to deforest less. It's a really challenging thing to do. We have to come up with creative ways to do that. We need to figure out, again, where these different populations are going to have different conservation strategies that we haven't really come up with yet. Yeah?
Why did you choose to study redstarts? And also, in the map, it seems like the breeding grounds are much more concentrated than where they hold the winter. I wonder if that has any input. If you could comment on that.
Sure. That's an interesting question. I started studying redstarts primarily because my advisor at Dartmouth was studying redstarts and black-throated blue warblers, and it presented a really good system to work. And in some ways, they suck because they're so small, and I can't put transmitters on the damn things. They're just so small, so I can't track them. So now I'm studying wood thrushes, much bigger birds. I can put geolocators on them. I'm studying catbirds. I'm studying a lot of other species that are bigger. I'm continuing to study redstarts because I can identify males and females without having to capture them. I can recapture them multiple times. I can do a variety of things like that to get at the questions that I'm interested in. There's not a perfect species out there, but redstarts have worked so far for me for the questions that I've been looking at. The overall winter range, what you need to think about, or in the breeding range, is the density of those birds. And the densities may not be constant across that entire range. So down in Louisiana, they tend to be not dense at all. Whereas if you go up in the Northeast, redstarts can be very, very dense. So it's hard to interpret the overall size of the wintering range relative to the overall size of what you see on that map for the breeding range. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Having seen a robin a week or two ago, what is the influence of climate change on just the whole migration? I mean, I know in Europe they're seeing birds staying in Europe rather than going to Africa.
Yeah, and we're seeing that here too. We're seeing ranges shifting north for many species. But ultimately, again, what influences, there's been lots of papers that have talked about the arrival times of birds getting earlier and earlier. But what people have ignored is that how could the arrival times get earlier and earlier if you're just looking at breeding ground temperatures? Because they're coming from the tropics. And birds in the tropics can't really detect what's going on with temperatures back up on breeding areas. At least I can't figure out how they can do that. So there's some fairly complex things that are going on with drying and precipitation trends in the wintering grounds that interact with changing temperature back up on breeding areas that can create some amazing ecological, what's known as a mismatch, that can really impact birds in ways, in subtle ways that we've only begun to start to understand. And we're actually seeing how that's starting to influence things like this phenomenon I referred to, natal dispersal, which refers to if you're young and you're produced at a particular spot in Rhode Island, how far you go down to the wintering grounds, and when you come back to breed, that natal dispersal refers to where you breed your first year. So if you breed in Connecticut, or if you breed in Rackham, Rhode Island, or if that bird goes all the way to, say, western New York, that natal dispersal is critical for driving genetic differentiation in populations. And what we're finding is that these changes in precipitation are starting to mess with this natal dispersal phenomenon. So global change or climate change in the tropics is really starting to change things as fundamental as the evolution of these animals. I probably told you more than you wanted to know. That's what I tend to do. I apologize. Yeah?
Do you think, is there any evidence of migratory patterns or locations of breeding and wintering and summering changing or adapting?
So, yeah, and I should say that I think migratory birds in general are quite flexible and quite adaptable. They have to be. They cover so many different areas. They do so many different things, and I think in some cases, many are adapted. Some species like the Kirtland's warbler is very specialized, but many others are very adaptable. Answering your question, for shorebirds, we know shorebirds will take different routes to get to, if there's a particular dry year in the western United States, you'll tend to get movements, major migratory movements that are of shorebirds that tend to correspond to more wetter areas where they can stop over and refuel. And it's interesting because what will also change are the migrations of raptors that follow the shorebirds to feed on them. With migratory songbirds, it's a harder thing to document. We can look at the timing, but it's much harder to document the spatial patterning that they're actually following. Now with geolocators, we can do this every year. I can put on 50 or 100 of these things every year, and I can do it with the same individuals, and I can now look at the repeatability of these long-distance migrations with year effects, such as a really good El Nino year, which is what we're experiencing now, a really, really dry Caribbean year. Our sites in Jamaica are bone dry. It's because of the El Nino. So I can look at these effects with things like geolocators. But we don't know. Yeah?
You said you were studying bobolinks and wood thrushes, both of which I'm a painter, but I'm
Yeah.
interested in those birds. And in Vermont, haying techniques are changing.
Yeah.
So that bobolinks that are returning can't really
That's right.
breed
Yeah.
because they're haying earlier. Does that affect the winter habitat? I mean, do those birds change where they go?
It's a wonderful question. We don't know. But the haying that occurs in a lot of these farms occurs at the exact time when they're breeding. And it just chops up the nests and the young. And if it keeps on causing repeated failure, those birds might actually depart earlier than birds that are actually successful and have prolonged parental care. So you can come up with a variety of scenarios, as I've just done, that might influence or might result in some sort of a carryover effect or seasonal interaction. But again, the examples I've just shown you with seasonal interactions and carryover effects, those are the majority of them. This is an area that's just emerging. We really don't know much about these sorts of things. People are getting excited about it, and that would be, I have good friends that are studying that very thing, and they'd love to look at that, I'm sure. Yeah?
What effect does a bird wearing one of these transmitters or geolocators have in terms of breeding success, attracting females? It's like showing a dainty bar with a lampshade on your head. And
Yeah.
Make a difference?
We haven't shown that it's made a difference. We haven't looked at it. It's possible that it has. The transmitters, I'd be surprised if that made a difference. Color bands on birds have been shown to make a difference. So, there's a famous study by a woman by the name of Nancy Burley who did this with zebra finches. They're very colorful captive birds, and she put bright red bands on some males' legs and just black bands on the birds' legs. And the birds with the really bright color bands had most of the opportunities for copulation with the females. And we've looked for trends of this in our data, and we've actually seen some patterns that I really don't want to go back and see again. So it's possible that some of the things we do to our birds messes with their biology. There's no question about it. but hopefully not too much. Yeah.
It is common in Europe, or more, certainly more common than in North America, northern North America, to eat small birds.
Yeah.
What is the effect? What kinds of effects does that have on global populations of these small birds?
Yeah, I don't know Italy is a perfect example of where small passerine songbirds have been harvested year after year after year after year. Believe it or not, Louisiana is another place. My wife's from Louisiana, and her father, and they'll all talk about going out there and hunting robins and making robin gumbo. But Italy is the classic example. And there, my colleagues there say that it has a major impact. They don't have the data, and in order to really show that, what you need to show is that the mortality that's caused by a particular effect, whether it's cats, I do a lot with trying to understand the impact of cats, or it's hunting by humans, you need to show that the mortality is not just compensatory, because a certain number of birds will die every year anyway, right? And it has no impact on the population. The population always rebounds. So you have to show that it's not just compensatory, but that it's additive mortality, that the mortality that's caused is significant enough that it actually causes a percentage shift, and doing that is not a trivial thing. So I believe, given what I've understood, because I've not yet had the chance to go to Italy, unfortunately, that the amount of birds that are taken in Italy can actually have quite an impact. Passenger pigeon is an example, actually, of where I think it's over-harvesting that's thought to have been the major impact. Isn't that right, Rachel? That actually impacted that species. And there's lots of species where harvesting for food is just causing the demise of species. One of the ones that I think of that's just really depressing is the bluefin tuna. And our over-harvesting of the bluefin tuna, and what that's doing, the population's down just to some ridiculous amount of animals now, but it's continuing to be harvested. And we know the exciting news is when we put moratoriums on these things, that these populations rebound. So they're quite resilient. So, yeah, it's a good point. And I don't know what the status of that is in Italy right now. I know there's some arguments about it. Yeah?
Right back to the wind turbine question, are most songbirds actually migrating at altitudes higher than turbines? Are they able to detect them at some other?
It varies. It depends. What happens, cell phone towers are much higher than a lot of these wind turbines. And I think a lot of these migrants, cell phone towers can get up, I don't know the exact height. The problem with cell phone towers is they have lights on them that attract the birds to them. So they'll actually come down, and they don't get killed by the tower itself. They get killed by the guy wires that are supporting the towers up. With wind turbines, you get some birds that are still moving during the day. Most of the migrations happen at night, but since a lot of these are placed, in some cases, on ridge tops, on mountaintops, or they're placed on coastal areas, or they're placed on the southern edges of lakes, what you have is a lot of interesting wind effects that cause birds to actually come down in altitude, and then they get nailed. That's the problem. Or when they're on top of ridge tops, they're actually already flying at lower elevations than they would have been initially, so they get nailed. But all of my information tells me that wind turbines don't impact birds as much as they do bats. They impact raptors, but I think there are ways to get around it. I think you don't have to operate them during peak periods of migration. In Europe, so a couple years ago, I was in Gibraltar, which is the southern tip of Spain. I'm going there actually in a couple weeks. I just can't wait to get there. But what's amazing is the northern coast of Morocco and the southern tip of Gibraltar are just covered in wind turbines. It's all you see are wind turbines. And what's so sad is that this is the major migratory route for all species to come up from Africa. All the Egyptian vultures, all of the amazing raptors that come up through there, the storks, they just shoot up from Morocco across the straits there up into Gibraltar, and then they head up north through Spain into Europe. Well, what they do on the Spain side is they have bird watchers that are looking for these large flocks of birds, and they shut down the turbines. They don't do that in Morocco, but they do it in southern Spain. So, again, another tangent. I apologize. Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to entertain some more questions.